They paid $5 for him. Not because he was worth it, but because the world believed he wasn't. $5 for a starving child, $5 for a life. The South expected to vanish in the cotton fields before he turned 12. $5 for a name the world would one day fear, honor, and whisper like a prophecy. Thomas Freeman. The year was 1874, and America was still bleeding from the Civil War. Towns smelled of gunpowder and grief. Widows walked like ghosts, and men who once ruled plantations now drank themselves silent in the shadows of broken porches. The country was free, they said, but in the deep South, freedom was a word spoken with clenched teeth and loaded rifles. On the edge of Marlowe Plantation, where the cane fields stretched into the night like endless graves, a child stood barefoot on a wooden crate, ribs showing through torn linen, wrists scarred from ropes far too heavy for someone his size. His eyes held no tears, no fear, only a quiet defiance that made the overseers uneasy. The auctioneer spat into the dirt. $5, he said, tapping the boy's shoulder. He ain't strong, he ain't talking. Probably won't live long, but he can be trained. Bidders shrugged. Children like him came and died like weeds, but an old man with shaking hands, Silas Crowder, a plantation broker, lifted his chin. $5, one coin, and the fate of America shifted. Silas didn't buy the child out of mercy, only need. The fields were dying, workers were fleeing, and the landowners demanded someone small enough to crawl into the snake-filled drainage ditches beneath the cane rows. Thomas was not bought for labor. He was bought for suffering. But the moment Silas's carriage rattled away with the child inside, something strange unfolded, something that even Silas could feel. The boy stared at him not with fear, but with a quiet, burning intelligence that made the old man cold in his bones. That night Thomas slept in a tool shed beside rusted blades, the floor damp with mud and mouse droppings, but he didn't sleep long. Thunder cracked across the sky, and lightning lit the fields in pale blue. He rose, walked to the shed door, and stared out at the world as if he could already see beyond it. Beyond the fields, beyond the chains, beyond the future. America wasn't ready for. By morning, rumors spread. The boy can read, whispered a house servant. Nonsense, spat the overseer. A slave child? Never. But Thomas had been born in secret to a woman who had once worked in a minister's home, a woman who risked lashes to teach her baby letters before he was sold away. Those stolen lessons became the foundation of what would shake a nation. Days turned into weeks. Thomas endured hunger, beatings, and back-breaking labor. But he watched everything, studied faces, memorized conversations, learned patterns of cruelty and weakness. He understood the plantation more deeply than the men who owned it. And then she appeared, Eleanor Whitford, a white widow living on the edge of the property. Her husband had died in the war, leaving her with books she no longer read and loneliness she no longer escaped. When she found Thomas one evening hiding from a storm beneath her porch, drenched and shivering, she didn't send him away. Instead, she handed him a towel, and then a book. "Do you know what this is?" she whispered. Thomas nodded. Thus began the secret that would alter American law. Night after night under candlelight, the widow taught him what her world forbade him to know: history, philosophy, law, scripture, rhetoric. Thomas absorbed it like a starving man given bread. He spoke little, but his mind sharpened like a blade. He began writing speeches in the dirt behind her house. He learned the power of words and how they could bring empires down. But secrets do not stay hidden on plantations. When Silas discovered what Eleanor had been doing, the South erupted. The child who was supposed to die in the fields had become something else, something dangerous. A boy of $5 was now a boy worth killing. And so Thomas ran, through swamps, over state lines, chased by gunshots and dogs. He survived on stolen apples and river water, but every mile he crossed, every night he survived, brought him closer to the destiny he would carve into American history. By the time he reached the North, he was no longer a slave child. He was a speaker, a mind sharpened by suffering, a voice that made crowds tremble, a symbol the South wanted erased, and America would soon learn that the boy bought for $5 was worth more than the nation could ever measure. The moment Thomas Freeman lifted the trembling, dirt-covered child onto the wooden auction block, a silence fell over the Charleston crowd that no amount of heat, flies, or murmured bids could break. It was not the kind of silence given to pity. It was the kind given to curiosity, the kind that slithered between men who sensed a strange opportunity. The boy was too small, too thin, barely 8 by appearance, though the tag on his wrist claimed 10. His wrists were marked with rope burns, his ribs sharply visible through his ragged shirt, and yet his eyes carried something that should not have survived inside a slave pen: defiance. Not loud, not foolish, but quiet and razor-thin, like a blade hidden under cloth, unnoticed until it draws blood. Freeman, a middle-aged trader with a reputation for ruthlessness and an instinct for profitable flesh, had no intention of putting this child on open sale. He had found him tied behind a barn on a bankrupt Virginia property, abandoned by an owner fleeing debt collectors. The boy was supposed to be worthless, too weak to pick, too fragile to last, too strange in manner to fetch a real price. Freeman saw something else. He always did. The boy didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't cling. He simply watched everything, every chain, every face, every shadow, and men like Freeman knew what it meant when a slave watched like that. They learned, they remembered, they became problems, but problems could still make money. When Freeman announced the starting bid, $5, the crowd chuckled. $5 could not buy a healthy chicken, let alone a human being. A man spat and said the boy wouldn't last a month. Another joked that the child looked like death walking on borrowed time. But no one stepped forward. No one wanted a fragile child who would die before earning back his food. Freeman smirked, knowing what would come next. Someone would take him out of pity or purchase him as a house toy for their children. Instead, a stranger in a faded black coat raised his hand. It was a small gesture, almost lazy, but it cut through the noise like a gunshot. The crowd turned. The man was unfamiliar, clearly not local. His hair was streaked with premature gray, his boots dusty from long travel, and his voice, when he spoke, was calm in a way that unsettled everyone. $5, that was all he said. No bargaining, no hesitation, as though the child was not a slave, not a burden, not a gamble, just a fact he had already accepted. Freeman stared at him, irritated by the ease of it. Something felt off, but a sale was a sale. He slammed his gavel, declared the purchase official, and pushed the boy toward the stranger. The child did not resist. That was the second strange thing. Most slave children clung to old owners, or cried in confusion, or recoiled from new hands. This one simply stepped off the block and stood beside the man as though some invisible decision had already been made inside him. The stranger looked down, not with kindness, but with calculation, as if measuring potential the same way a blacksmith measures iron, testing for weaknesses, imagining what it might become when shaped under fire. The crowd dispersed, with rumors forming instantly. Some said the man was a former preacher fallen from grace. Others claimed he worked for the federal government. A few whispered that he was an abolitionist traveling undercover. Freeman didn't care what he was. What mattered was that he had rid himself of a liability and earned $5 more than the value of a dying child. He washed his hands of it, never imagining that this single sale would unravel pieces of American history that had been tightly stitched for generations. The child, now legally the property of a stranger whose name he had not yet heard, followed silently as they walked away from the auction yard. The streets were loud, filled with carts, horses, and the thick humidity of the South, yet the boy moved with a detached calm that made the man pause. "What is your name?" he asked. For a moment the boy said nothing. His throat worked as if swallowing old wounds, old commands, old silences. "Thomas," he whispered finally. "Thomas." It was common enough, simple enough, forgettable enough. But the man did not repeat it aloud. He only nodded once, as though storing it away in a place that would matter later. What the man did not know, what no one in that crowded marketplace could have guessed, was that Thomas had not been born into obedience. The boy had been raised under a mother who hid a forbidden literacy, a father who whispered maps of the world through cracks in nighttime walls, and a grandfather who had been taken from Africa but carried an iron memory of freedom that he poured into every grandchild before dying from a master's whip. Thomas carried all of that in him. Fragile, yes, but unbroken. His mind was a furnace in which every injustice was melted and reshaped into knowledge, awareness, and something far more dangerous. As they traveled away from Charleston and into quieter roads, the stranger occasionally glanced at him. He saw a child who never asked questions but whose silence was alive. He saw a boy who kept track of direction, distance, time, small details slaves were never meant to notice. He saw something forming beneath the surface, something neither obedience nor fear could control. By the time they reached their destination, by the time the stranger revealed his name and his true intentions, by the time Thomas realized he had not been bought to serve, but to be hidden, trained, and used in ways that would scorch the foundation of America's most guarded secrets, it was already too late to undo the fate sealed with that $5 bid. What began as a cheap purchase in a dusty auction yard would become the spark of the most unexpected transformation in U.S. history. And the child no one wanted, the child bought for less than a pair of boots, would soon become a name powerful men learned to fear. The road stretched out in a long, crooked line as the stranger guided the horse-drawn wagon deeper into the South Carolina backwoods. The sun had begun to bleed orange behind the cypress trees, turning the world into a silhouette of shadows and murmuring insects. Thomas sat beside him, small, silent, and watchful, trying to understand the quiet man who had purchased him with the ease of someone choosing a loaf of bread. The stranger did not speak for nearly an hour after leaving Charleston. He rode with the steady calm of someone carrying secrets under his coat. Occasionally he looked at Thomas with an unreadable expression. Not pity, not cruelty, but something colder and more complex. Thomas kept his head lowered, though his eyes catalogued every movement. Only when the sky deepened into dusk did the man finally speak. "You are not going where slaves go." Thomas stiffened. His fingers curled against the wooden seat. The stranger continued, "You were not bought to pick cotton. You were not bought to serve a household. You will not be beaten here unless you give me reason." The words were strange, almost unbelievable. Thomas had spent enough time in holding pens to understand the patterns of men. No white man bought a child for $5 to give him freedom or kindness. Nothing the stranger said felt safe. Everything felt like a trap with good manners. Still, the man seemed to sense the storm inside Thomas. He turned his gaze back to the road. "I expect something from you," he added, and this time there was a weight to his tone, something that will require obedience and silence. "If you can do that, your life will not be as the others." Those words struck more fear into Thomas than any whip. A slave's fate was predictable, brutal, but known. This man spoke of something unknown, shaped not by chains but by purpose. Purposes were more dangerous. Purposes changed a child into something else. As they rode, the night air thickened. Fireflies blinked in the distance, their small lights floating like lost spirits. The stranger's voice softened, almost thoughtful, as he finally told Thomas his name. "Christopher Hale." Thomas repeated the name quietly in his mind, imprinting it with the instinct of someone who had survived only by remembering faces and names. Christopher Hale drove the wagon off the main road, down a narrow, unmarked path that wound between towering oaks. Their branches arched like ancient ribs overhead. The deeper they went, the more Thomas felt the world closing in around them. Isolated, hidden, far from any plantation or town, at the end of the path stood a large, unpainted house with shuttered windows and a porch that sagged with age. No lanterns glowed, no voices drifted from inside. It looked abandoned, yet the man walked toward it as though returning home. Thomas felt the air shift. He did not move until Hale gestured. Inside, the child obeyed, stepping onto the creaking porch, heart pounding. The door opened with a long groan, revealing a dark interior that smelled of old wood, dust, and something else. Ink. Hale lit a single oil lamp, and its soft glow revealed the truth. The house was not empty. It was filled with papers, maps, shelves of books, and wooden crates marked with the insignia of various states. A pile of newspapers lay scattered across a table, charts with hand-drawn routes spread across the walls. This was not a plantation home. It was a headquarters. Hale watched Thomas absorb everything. Then he closed the door behind them with a soft click. "I am not a farmer," he said. "I do not keep slaves. What I keep is information. What I collect is truth. And what I need is someone small, unnoticed, and intelligent." Thomas felt the world tilt beneath him. Intelligent. No slave trader had ever used that word in his presence. The boy's breathing quickened. He remembered his mother's whispered lessons in the dusk, her finger tracing letters in the dirt. He remembered the careful way she told him to hide what he knew. The world punishes thinking slaves. Thinking gets you killed. Yet this man seemed to want that forbidden thing. Hale crouched to Thomas's eye level, studying him the way a scientist studies an unfamiliar specimen. Children can go where adults cannot. They can slip into kitchens, attics, offices, counting rooms. They hear things, they observe, they repeat nothing unless told. That is what I need. Eyes and ears in places where mine cannot reach. Thomas tried to swallow, but his throat felt tight. He understood now. He was not bought as a laborer. He was bought as a tool, a spy, a child ghost slipping through the cracks of the South, gathering truths that men with guns could never access. Hale rose to his full height. The government does not know my face, he admitted, nor will they know yours. We operate between shadows. What we learn can decide laws, elections, wars. The room felt suddenly colder. Thomas realized the weight of this man's intentions. This was not about saving one child. This was about using one child to shape the fate of millions. Hale finally motioned toward a small room off the hallway. Inside was a bed, thin but clean, and a table with a small oil lamp. You will sleep here. You will eat well. You will be taught to read and write, but you must earn it. Thomas stepped into the room slowly, unsure whether to feel relief or terror. Everything about the situation felt wrong. Freedom was not real here. It was just a quieter form of captivity. But it was also opportunity. Dangerous, sharp, unpredictable opportunity. Before closing the door halfway, Hale spoke once more. You were bought for $5. That makes you forgettable to the world. Good. We need someone the world will not notice until it is too late. The door clicked softly. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, heart trembling, mind racing. All his life he had been told that he was nothing but a body for labor. Yet here he was, in a hidden house filled with secrets, chosen not for strength but for his mind. He did not yet know the truth, that Hale's plans for him would place his young life on a collision course with some of the most dangerous men of the century, nor that his quiet intelligence would one day reshape the nation's darkest machinery. All he knew was that the world had just changed, and he was no longer sure who he was. Morning came quietly to the hidden house. Thomas woke before sunrise, the way he had learned to do in holding pens and slave yards. But here, the silence felt different, too still, too calculated. When he stepped into the hallway, he found Christopher Hale already awake, seated at a long table covered in papers, as if he had not slept at all. Without looking up, Hale pointed toward an empty chair. Sit, your lessons begin today. Thomas obeyed, unsure what kind of lessons awaited him. In his world, learning was forbidden. Whips and chains were easier to control than mines, yet Hale placed a small chalkboard before him, and beside it, a battered primer book with frayed edges. You will read, he said, tapping the page. You already know more than you let on. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise. Thomas's heart lurched. He stared at the letters, shapes his mother had once traced into the dirt behind their cabin. He had hidden that knowledge ever since, burying it under fear, but Hale saw through him with unsettling ease. Slowly, Thomas nodded and began to read. Hale listened in silence, expression unreadable, until Thomas finished the first page. Good, he said. You learn quickly. That is why I chose you. The boy said nothing, but inside him something stirred, a mixture of pride, fear, and a small, fragile hope he did not dare to name. The lessons did not stop at reading. Hale introduced arithmetic next, then maps, then simple codes, symbols used to hide messages in plain sight. Every hour brought something new, something dangerous. Thomas felt his mind thickening with information, expanding into spaces he had never known existed. But the learning was not gentle. Hale was not a patient schoolmaster, he was a man shaping a tool. When Thomas hesitated, Hale corrected him sharply. When he made mistakes, Hale demanded he redo the task until it was perfect. The man did not raise his voice. He did not strike, yet his cold precision was its own kind of pressure, forcing Thomas to sharpen himself or be discarded. Days passed, weeks blurred, the house became a strange mix of safety and threat. Thomas slept on a real bed, he ate warm meals, yet every kindness came chained to expectation. Hale pushed him constantly, drilling him with the intensity of someone who had no time to waste. One afternoon, Hale pulled out a set of old coins and placed them on the table. "What do you see?" Thomas studied them, confused. "Coins," he answered. "Copper, silver, worn at the edges." Hale shook his head. "Look again. Look at the details." Thomas leaned closer. After a moment, he noticed something odd. The dates didn't match the marks of wear. One coin bore tiny scratches near the edge, too precise to be accidental. When he pointed this out, Hale's eyes brightened with approval. "Those marks are signals, silent messages. Only those trained to see them will recognize them, and now you are one of them." It was the first time Hale had spoken to Thomas not as property, but as an apprentice. The realization left the boy breathless. The training expanded into physical lessons as well. Hale taught him how to walk quietly, how to move without attracting attention, how to listen to conversations without appearing to listen at all. He showed him how to read expressions on a man's face, how to sense deceit, how to remain calm when surrounded by danger. "You will be invisible," Hale insisted, "not because you are small, but because you will understand people better than they understand themselves." Thomas absorbed each lesson with a hunger that came from years of being underestimated. Intelligence, once a secret shame, was becoming his power. Yet even as he learned, questions began to stir in him. Why me? Why this? Why invest so much into a child he bought for $5? One night, unable to silence the curiosity burning inside him, Thomas asked Hale the question directly. "Why are you teaching me all this?" Hale paused, the lamplight casting sharp shadows across his face. "Because the South is preparing for something," he said quietly. "Something dark. Something that will shape the future of this country, and I intend to know every secret before it happens. You will help me do that." The boy's pulse quickened. Hale continued, his voice lower. "You will enter houses, plantations, counting rooms, political offices. You will listen to the whispers of powerful men. You will gather what they do not want the world to know." Thomas realized with chilling clarity that the training was not simply to make him useful, it was to make him indispensable. Yet Hale was not the only presence in the house. Occasionally, strangers would visit, men who spoke in hushed tones, carrying sealed letters and coded messages. They never stayed long, and they never acknowledged Thomas. But he watched them from the shadows, memorizing their faces, the way Hale seemed both familiar and wary with them. Over time, Thomas began to understand Hale was part of something larger, a network built from secrecy and silent allegiance, and Thomas was being shaped into its smallest but sharpest blade. One evening, Hale tested him. He placed a piece of folded paper on the table. Inside was a simple message written in numbers. "Decode it," he instructed. Thomas studied it carefully. The cipher was one Hale had introduced only days earlier. He hesitated, heart pounding, then began to translate. It took nearly half an hour, but when he finished, Hale nodded with rare satisfaction. "You're ready. Ready for what?" Thomas asked, voice barely above a whisper. Hale extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into shadow. "Your first assignment." Thomas felt the world shift again, the way it had the night Hale brought him here. Training was over. Childhood, what little remained of it, was over too. He was no longer just a boy. He was becoming a weapon forged in the quiet, hidden corners of a nation on the brink of transformation, and soon the world beyond this house would feel the impact of a child no one believed mattered. The morning of the first mission arrived with a cold stillness that seemed to swallow the world around the hidden house. Thomas woke before Hale called for him, feeling the weight of something he could not yet name. He had trained for weeks, reading, memorizing, decoding, listening, but this was different. This was stepping beyond the threshold, leaving the safety of shadows for a world that could destroy him with a single wrong glance. Hale entered the room carrying a small bundle of clothing. "You cannot go as yourself," he said simply. Thomas watched as Hale laid the garments on the bed, coarse trousers, a frayed shirt, and a cap that made him look younger, smaller and poorer than he truly was. A house servant's cast-off, a child meant to blend into the background. Thomas dressed in silence, feeling less like a boy and more like a piece of equipment being prepared for use. When he turned, Hale examined him with the same clinical gaze he used on coded messages. "Good. Forget who you are. Today you are. No one gets noticed, no one gets questioned. The words were cold but true. A nameless child could slip through places an adult could not. That was his value. Hale led him outside to a simple wagon, nothing like the one he had been brought in. This one was worn, muddy, pulled by an older mule, the kind used by poor farmers or low-rank traders, perfect for invisibility. Thomas climbed in, clutching the small satchel Hale handed him. Inside was a folded cloth, a scrap of paper, and the smallest piece of charcoal he had ever seen. Tools, Hale explained. You will know how to use them when the time comes. As the wagon rattled down the narrow forest path, Hale remained silent, eyes forward, jaw tight. Thomas sensed the tension beneath his calm exterior. This mission mattered. It was not a test, it was necessity. At last the trees thinned, revealing the sprawling outlines of a plantation Thomas had never seen before. It was larger than any he had passed on the way to Charleston months earlier. White columns rose like sentinels, and enslaved workers moved across the yard like pieces on a board. This plantation, Hale said quietly, belongs to a man named Bartholomew Pike. He is involved in something dangerous, something we need to know. Today, you will find out what that is. Thomas felt his pulse hammer in his chest. Hale reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded note sealed with wax. You will not read this, he instructed. You will deliver it to the woman inside the kitchen house. Ask for Miriam. Say nothing else. Thomas nodded, memorizing every detail. Hale handed him the note, then placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Remember what I taught you. Watch faces, not words. Listen even when no one is speaking, and above all, leave before they have a reason to look at you twice. The boy stepped down from the wagon, adjusting the cap over his hair. He walked toward the back of the property where the kitchen house stood, smoke rising lazily from the chimney. No one paid attention to him. He looked exactly like the kind of stray errand child passed between households. Inside, the smell of roasting meat and boiling vegetables filled the room. A woman turned, eyes sharp but not unkind. You, Miriam? Thomas asked softly. The woman stiffened, then nodded. He handed her the note. She pressed it quickly against her apron, hiding it as if it were contraband. The exchange took seconds, but something else caught Thomas's attention. A low murmur of voices behind a half-closed door leading to a pantry. He didn't look directly, but allowed his eyes to flick toward the door in a way that suggested childish curiosity. Two men stood inside, whispering urgently. He heard only fragments. Shipment, meeting, Charleston docks, night before the 12th, rifles hidden in crates, rifles. Thomas pretended not to notice as Miriam handed him a small piece of cornbread, playing her role. Run along now, child. He nodded and left the kitchen, heart racing with every step, but the mission was not over. On his way back across the yard, he noticed a second detail. Something Hale had warned him always to look for. The overseer was watching. Him, not suspiciously, not yet, but with mild curiosity, enough to be dangerous. Thomas slowed his pace, lowered his head, and shuffled like a tired child instead of a trained observer. The overseer's interest faded. Thomas kept moving. Finally, he reached the edge of the property. Beyond the last row of cabins, the forest waited like a friend with open arms. He slipped inside the trees, breath catching in relief. Minutes later, Hale emerged from deeper within the woods, as if he had never left Thomas alone. Report, he said quietly. Thomas relayed every detail he had gathered. Hale's eyes sharpened with each word. The mention of rifles made his expression turn grim. When Thomas finished, Hale nodded slowly. That was more than I expected. Well done. The praise struck Thomas with unexpected warmth. But it was fleeting. Hale's face hardened. This confirms what we feared. Pike is preparing for something violent, something coordinated, and this meeting at the docks. If we don't stop it, there will be bloodshed across 3 states. Thomas swallowed. What happens now? Now, Hale said, we follow the trail you uncovered, and you will go deeper. They returned to the wagon in silence. The forest swallowed the plantation behind them, but Thomas felt its shadow clinging to his skin. He had entered the lion's den and returned alive, but not unchanged. For the first time, he understood the stakes. This wasn't just secret messages or silent training. This was war in slow motion, fought in whispers, glances, hidden rooms, and coded notes, and he, a child bought for $5, had just become a piece on that battlefield. When they reached the hidden house again, Hale stopped him before he went inside. "You did well, Thomas. But this is only the beginning. From here on, everything becomes more dangerous." Thomas looked up at him, eyes steady. "I'm ready." Hale studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Tomorrow," he said, "we start preparing for your next mission." And just like that, the boy's life moved forward, away from the innocence he never truly had, and into a destiny he never asked for but could no longer escape. The storm came that night, rattling the windows of the hidden house as if the sky itself were trying to warn them. Thunder rolled across the forest like cannon fire, and each flash of lightning illuminated Hale sitting at the long wooden table, staring at a map spread out before him. Thomas stood beside him, the last drops of rain clinging to his clothes after he'd run from the wagon. His heart still beat fast from the mission, but there was no time to rest. Hale's voice was urgent in a way Thomas had never heard before. "Sit, look here." Thomas obeyed. The map was unlike the simple ones he had studied during lessons. This one was marked with circles, arrows, and coded notations written in Hale's tight, disciplined handwriting. Small wooden pieces, like game tokens, were scattered across the territories of Georgia, South Carolina, and the edge of Alabama. Hale moved one piece, tapping it lightly. "This is Pike's plantation. This is where you just were, that we already knew." But he slid another token along a faint inked line toward the Charleston docks. "And this is the part we didn't know until today." Thomas stared at the token's path. The line traveled through 3 other plantations, each marked with a different symbol. Hale explained that these were locations connected to Pike, landowners who shared his political beliefs, men who gathered in private meetings behind locked doors, men who hated change, who feared any shift in the world they controlled, and who were willing to kill to keep it. "The rifles," Thomas murmured, eyes widening. Hale nodded. "Enough weapons to arm 200 men, enough to ignite a coordinated uprising, one led not by slaves seeking freedom, but by plantation masters trying to seize political power before the government could stop them. If they succeed," Hale said, "the balance in the South shifts, and if the balance shifts, the country follows." The boy looked at the map again, now understanding the weight of each symbol. This wasn't about one plantation, one master, one shipment of rifles. It was a network, a conspiracy woven deep into the soil of the South, hidden behind polite smiles and Sunday hymns. "What do we do?" Thomas asked, his voice quiet. Hale leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "We disrupt it, piece by piece, quietly, before they realize anyone is watching." Lightning cracked outside, shaking the walls. Hale didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled out a small wooden box from beneath the table. He opened it, revealing a collection of objects Thomas had never seen before. Small coded books, false seals for letters, a broken pocket watch with a hidden compartment, and slips of parchment covered in hurried writing. "This," Hale said, "is everything we've gathered over the past 2 years, but it isn't enough. What you learned today is more valuable than half of what's in this box." Thomas felt a flicker of pride, but it vanished quickly when Hale fixed him with a sharp stare. "And now that you've proven yourself, we're moving faster. Faster toward what?" Thomas wondered, though he did not ask outright. He didn't have to. Hale answered the unspoken question. "There is one man Pike trusts above all others. One man who moves between plantations carrying messages, instructions, lists of supporters. If we find him, we cut the head from the snake." "The courier," Thomas whispered. Hale nodded. "A phantom," he added. "No one knows his name, no one knows his face. He's careful, secretive, moves at night, travels alone, but he must be found." Thomas felt the room close in around him. The idea of tracking a man who didn't want to be found, who carried the lifeblood of a rebellion, was terrifying. Hale saw the fear but did not soften his tone. "This is why I trained you. This is why you're here." He pushed the map closer. "Look at this. Look at the path he must take." Thomas studied the map carefully. The plantations were far apart, connected by narrow back roads and swamp trails only locals would know. But one detail stood out: a bottleneck, a point where every route passed through a small, barely noticeable crossroads. Thomas pointed at it. Here. Hale smiled for the first time that night. Exactly. This crossroads is called Wicker's Bend. If he carries messages between these men, he must pass through it, and when he does, we will know. How? Thomas asked. Hale opened a drawer and revealed a small metal cylinder with a glass top. Inside it was a rolled piece of paper. When Thomas tilted it, the glass glimmered faintly. A spyglass? He asked. Hale chuckled. Much more than that. This, he explained, is a device used by surveyors. It can see from a distance without drawing attention. We place it at Wicker's Bend. You, Thomas, will hide nearby. You will watch every traveler who passes. If the courier appears, you will follow him. Thomas's stomach tightened. Follow him alone? Hale looked directly into his eyes. Yes, no one else can do it. A man would be noticed, a woman questioned, but a child, he becomes invisible. Thunder growled outside as Thomas realized the truth. His next mission would not be a simple message delivery or overheard whispers. It would require patience, stealth, and courage he wasn't sure he possessed. Hale placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. I will be close, he said. But you must lead this part, and you must be careful. If the courier senses you, he will not hesitate. Men like him do not leave witnesses. The seriousness of the words chilled Thomas. But he nodded. They studied the map late into the night. Hale explained the terrain, the hidden marshes, the abandoned mill near Wicker's Bend where Thomas could hide. He described the courier's habits, swift, silent, ruthless. Thomas listened, memorizing everything, forcing fear to harden into determination. Hours later, when the storm finally softened and the house grew quiet, Thomas lay awake in his small room. The events of the day swirled in his mind, the plantation, the whispering men, the rifles, the map of secrets, the dangerous mission ahead. He stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on his thin chest. He thought of his mother, of the lessons she whispered in the dark. She had told him knowledge was dangerous, but she had also told him knowledge was power. Tonight he understood both truths. Hale was trusting him with something enormous, something that could change the country if handled right, or destroy him if handled wrong. And as the first light of dawn began to creep across the floor, Thomas knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would not fail. The courthouse of Harlan County had never seen so many bodies pressed into its wooden ribs. The building itself seemed to groan under the weight of expectation, as if it knew that history sat trembling inside its frame on the morning of Thomas Freeman's trial. People climbed trees, leaned over balconies, and crowded every window just to get a glimpse of the $5 slave child who had climbed so far beyond the station life had assigned. The air carried the strange mixture of curiosity, suspicion, awe, and bitterness, as if every soul in attendance believed they were witnessing more than a legal proceeding. They were witnessing a turning of the earth. Thomas had not slept the night before the lantern in the jail corridor flickered through the bars of his cell, casting long silhouettes across the floor. He sat awake listening to the distant hum of angry voices outside, men who wanted him punished, women who whispered their support, soldiers who didn't know where to stand in the divided crowd. Freedom had carved a deep wound in the American psyche, and Thomas, as young as he was, had become a symbol of that wound. A reminder of what the nation had done, a reminder of what it still resisted when the guards finally arrived to escort him into the courtroom. He stood tall, his wrists shackled but his spine straight as a rail. He refused to shuffle, refused to appear broken. They could bind his arms, but not his past, his memory, or his right to speak. The walk from his cell to the courthouse door should have taken less than a minute. Instead, it stretched like a pilgrimage. Every footstep echoed the weight of all the enslaved children who had ever been bought, sold, whipped, or silenced. Each clang of his chains felt like an elegy for the centuries of pain he carried in his blood. Inside the courtroom, the judge watched Thomas with a gaze that tried to disguise curiosity with authority, but even he could not hide the tremor in his throat. This case had grown far beyond the boundaries of his gavel. Newspapers from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia filled the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. Sketch artists captured every tilt of Thomas's head. Every major abolitionist society in the North had sent representatives to attend. A teenage boy who had been purchased for the price of a small farm animal had risen into national relevance, and now the country wanted to decide whether to elevate him further or crush him into the dirt. The charges against Thomas were written with the heaviness of accusation. He was accused of inciting unrest, encouraging rebellion, stealing property, resisting arrest, and disturbing the fragile order of Reconstruction. But beneath the legal language, everyone knew the truth. They were not trying Thomas Freeman, the individual. They were trying the idea that a former slave could become more than what society permitted. They were putting hope on trial. They were putting the future on trial. When Thomas was finally allowed to speak, the courtroom fell silent. He stood behind the wooden stand, the light of morning cutting a pale line across his cheek, and he began with a voice so steady it startled the spectators. He did not speak like a frightened child. He spoke like a witness to centuries of truth. He told the court of the day he was bought for $5, the rough hands that measured his limbs, the cold eyes that evaluated his worth. He spoke of hunger that gnawed his bones, of nights where he slept on dirt floors, of the screams he had heard in the plantation quarters of families torn apart like paper scrolls. But he did not stop there. He told them how education had changed him, how a single woman's kindness had given him books, how letters had unlocked his mind, how understanding history had taught him to demand a place within it. He painted a portrait of America's contradictions, its cruelty and its promise, its violence and its unbelievable potential. He spoke with such clarity that some spectators wept silently in their seats, while others clenched their fists, determined not to let their hearts soften. Then came the prosecution. Their argument was built on fear. They claimed Thomas was dangerous because he was articulate, educated, determined. They described him not as a boy, but as a threat to the social hierarchy, a spark that could ignite rebellion. They pointed at his intelligence as if it were a crime. They pointed at his courage as if it were a disease. The crowd fractured into two storms. Some cheered for him. Some cursed his existence. Men shouted until the bailiffs threatened to remove them. Women clutched handkerchiefs and prayed under their breath. The nation itself seemed split down the center, and Thomas stood in the fracture line, bracing himself for the final blow. The closing arguments shook the room. The prosecutor called Thomas an experiment that had gone too far, an example of why former slave children should never be educated. He warned the court that allowing Thomas to walk free would embolden thousands like him. The defense insisted that the country could not claim freedom while punishing a boy for reaching for it. They argued that Thomas was not a threat, but a testament to what the nation could become. When the jury finally withdrew, the courthouse felt like a coffin. Each minute stretched. Each breath was heavy. Thomas stared at the floor, murmuring words no one else could hear. Maybe they were prayers, maybe memories, maybe a quiet conversation with the ghosts of all who came before him. Hours later, the jurors returned, their faces unreadable. The judge cleared his throat. The entire crowd leaned forward, holding the same shared breath like a single fragile heartbeat. Whatever the verdict would be, Thomas knew one truth: his story had already changed something in the world forever. Before Thomas Freeman had a name the world respected, before newspapers carved his story into columns, and before scholars argued about his legacy, there was one woman who saw something in him long before the nation ever would. Her name was Eleanor Whitlock, and though history rarely carves statues for women like her, the truth is this: Thomas's revolution began in her small lamp-lit parlor long before any courtroom decided his fate. She was not the loudest, not the wealthiest, and not the most powerful, but she was the one who held a mirror to Thomas's young face and showed him what he could become. Eleanor had once belonged to the old Southern aristocracy, but after the war she had quietly severed herself from the decaying roots of her family's beliefs. The plantation she inherited was a hollow grave of its former self: fields, overgrown buildings, collapsing cotton gins rusting in the sun. The family name still carried weight, but not the kind that opened doors, the kind that hung around your neck, reminding you of sins you did not choose but were expected to carry. She refused that weight. She chose her own truth. On the morning she found Thomas starving, barefoot, and trembling in the abandoned cane shed behind her property, she expected nothing more than a frightened runaway child. She approached him gently, food in one hand, a lantern in the other, expecting him to flinch, expecting him to hide. Instead, she found a pair of eyes that forced her to stop, eyes that, despite hunger, despite bruises, held a clarity she had never seen in a child. His gaze carried questions and fire, and a strange stillness that made her chest tighten as if she were looking at fate itself. Thomas did not speak at first. When he finally whispered his name, it sounded as if he were reciting something fragile, something that could shatter if said too loud. She asked him if he had a family. He said nothing. She did not ask again. Some wounds speak louder than answers. Eleanor broke every rule of Southern custom. When she brought him inside, she washed his wounds, fed him, gave him a place to sleep, and when she realized his life would never be safe outside her walls, she made a decision that would brand her a traitor to her blood, her neighbors, and her heritage. She chose Thomas. She chose the child with the $5 past and a mind sharp as a blade. She chose him knowing full well the world would punish her for it. Teaching him to read began as an act of compassion but quickly grew into an act of rebellion. Thomas absorbed knowledge with a hunger that startled her. He devoured every book she placed before him. Geography, scripture, abolitionist pamphlets, poetry, maps of the northern city's newspapers from faraway places that promised a different world. He asked questions that tugged at the roots of her conscience. He studied each answer as if preparing for a destiny neither of them could yet name. But with knowledge came danger. Word spread through the county faster than rain through a broken roof. A woman teaching a former slave child was an outrage. A woman of Southern lineage doing it voluntarily was a crime in the eyes of men who believed the world should never change. The threats started. Small letters shoved under her door, muttered curses at church cold stares when she walked into town. Then came the real dangers. Horses gathering outside at night, shadows lingering near her porch, voices carried by the wind promising retribution. Still, she did not stop. If anything, she taught Thomas faster, harder, with a determination fueled by defiance. She trained him in rhetoric, debate, memory, discipline. She sharpened him against the world like a hidden blade, preparing him for the moment she knew would eventually arrive, the moment he would stand alone. Eleanor sat in the front row of the courtroom during Thomas's trial. Her presence alone was enough to send sparks through the crowd. Some called her a hero, some called her insane, some called her a traitor, but none could deny the truth. She embodied the boy on trial was more than a symbol. He was her work, her belief, her rebellion carved into living flesh throughout the trial. She never once lowered her gaze. She watched every accusation, every insult, every attempt to portray Thomas as a threat, and she did not flinch. Her posture was stiff, her hands folded tightly, but her resolve was unbreakable. The prosecution despised her, not because she protected Thomas, but because she had made him impossible to control. They had wanted him ignorant, they had wanted him invisible. She had made him neither. When Thomas delivered his testimony, Eleanor felt something shift within her. He did not sound like a boy. He sounded like a man shaped by history, sharpened by pain, lifted by education. A man ready to confront the world that once considered him property. And in that moment she realized she had succeeded far beyond anything she had imagined. She had wanted to save his life, but she had done something far more powerful. She had armed him with purpose. It was Eleanor who submitted the petitions to Northern politicians. It was Eleanor who wrote to abolitionist circles begging them to attend the trial. It was Eleanor who leaked the details of Thomas's story to newspapers, knowing it would ignite public outrage. She used her name, her dwindling wealth, and her fractured reputation to turn a small rural case into a national spectacle. She gave the trial a spotlight so bright the South could no longer hide behind shadows. At night, while the jury deliberated, Thomas looked at her through the bars of the holding cell. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The silence carried every lesson she had ever taught him, every risk she had taken, every hope she had planted. Finally, she told him something he would never forget. "You were never mine to protect, Thomas. You were only mine to prepare." She said it with calm, steady certainty, the kind of calm that only comes from knowing your purpose is complete. And when the verdict came, when the nation held its breath, she was there, ready to rise, ready to fight, ready to stand beside him no matter which way history leaned, because behind every revolution the world remembers lies a single soul. The world forgets. And for Thomas Freeman, that soul was Eleanor Whitlock. The night Thomas Freeman delivered the speech that rattled the nation, The air itself felt charged, as if history were crouched in the shadows waiting to pounce. It was the winter of 1874, cold enough that breath turned to smoke, yet the hall in New Haven overflowed with bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, men standing in aisles, women fanning themselves, children perched on window ledges, hoping to witness the young man newspapers called the miracle child of the South. The room hummed with anticipation. Some came to listen, some came to protest. But all came because Thomas had become impossible to ignore. He stepped onto the stage with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived too much to fear anything human. His face still held traces of the boy who had been bought for $5, but his posture belonged to a man shaped by storms. His eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd, reading them silently the way he had once studied the shifting moods of slave owners, guards, bounty hunters, and judges. He understood how mobs behaved. He knew that beneath the surface of applause or anger, there was always a fuse waiting for a spark. Thomas opened his speech with a single sentence, a sentence that would echo through the country for months. "The South did not break my chains. I broke them myself." The hall erupted, half in cheers, half in offended murmurs, but Thomas didn't pause. He pressed forward, voice, steady words, sharpened by every injustice he had endured. He spoke of children beaten for learning letters, of mothers torn from infants, of men who died nameless in cotton fields. He described the plantation graveyards where crosses rotted before the bodies beneath them. He recited stories whispered to him by elders during long nights on the slave quarters. Stories the South wanted, forgotten stories that clawed their way up through generations like buried truth refusing to stay dead. And as he spoke, something stirring and powerful began to build inside the room. Thomas's greatest gift was not his memory or his intelligence, but the way he could fold pain into language and hand it back to the world as a weapon. He told them that freedom without dignity was hollow, that justice delayed was justice denied, that the war may have ended, but the chains had only changed shape. He described laws that punished instead of protected, police that hunted instead of safeguarded, courts that silenced instead of listened. He exposed every hypocrisy with the precision of a surgeon cutting through diseased flesh. Then he turned his attack directly toward the Southern lawmakers who wanted him dead. He named them one by one, their plantations, their crimes, their attempts to resurrect the old order. Under new names, the audience gasped at each name spoken, as if they were witnessing a duel between a lone man and an entire empire. The newspapers would later say that no one had ever dared speak so boldly, so dangerously, so publicly. But Thomas was not finished. He raised his hand, and the hall fell silent at that moment, his voice lowered, becoming cold, steady, unshakable. "If this nation continues to deny the humanity of the people it once chained," he said, "there will be another war, and this one will not be fought with uniforms or flags. It will be fought with truth, and the pen is already sharper than any sword. The South can draw." Those words struck the crowd like a thunderclap. Some leapt to their feet, cheering, others shouted curses. A group of men in the back lunged forward, only to be restrained by marshals. Several tried to storm the stage, but were blocked. The hall exploded into chaos, but Thomas remained standing, calm, unflinching, as if he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind. He had studied the temperament of America, and he knew precisely where to strike. Outside the hall, white supremacist groups gathered, furious, chanting threats, demanding his arrest. Rumors spread that the governor had ordered troops to control the crowd. Some insisted Thomas had just incited treason. Others insisted he had said what the nation needed to hear. Federal agents debated whether to detain him or protect him. No one knew which choice would spark bloodshed. By midnight, the newspapers were already printing headlines calling him the most dangerous black orator since the Civil War. Some Southern papers demanded his execution. Some Northern ones called him the voice of a new era. Letters flooded political offices, some praising him, some demanding his silencing. The country seemed to lean in two different directions at once, as if unsure whether to tear itself apart or finally face the truth it had avoided since Appomattox. Thomas spent the night in hiding, Eleanor Whitlock by his side. They waited in an abandoned carriage house lit only by a single lantern. He sat on a wooden crate, silent, while outside mobs roamed the streets searching for him. Eleanor watched him quietly, noticing that he did not tremble, did not pace, did not show fear. Instead, he looked tired, deeply tired, in a way only revolutionaries knew. She finally asked him whether he regretted his words. He answered with a softness that startled her. "I have carried those words my whole life," he said. "Tonight I simply stopped carrying them alone by morning." The entire nation was divided. Some wanted him imprisoned, others wanted him protected. Some believed he was a prophet, others believed he was a curse. But even his enemies admitted one truth. Thomas Freeman had done in one night what armies had failed to do in 4 years. He made America confront itself. He made the country look into its own reflection and decide whether to break or rebuild. That is why his speech nearly started a war, not because he threatened violence, but because he threatened silence. Silence is what the South had depended on. Silence is what injustice thrives on. Silence is what Thomas destroyed with a single voice rising from a past that refused to stay buried. He did not merely speak, he detonated history the morning after Thomas Freeman's speech. The world seemed unhinged. Across the South, papers were burning with outrage while Northern presses celebrated him as a beacon of change. Yet, in the shadows of this national spectacle, a network of quiet, dangerous figures moved to protect the boy who had been bought for $5. It was not government soldiers, nor politicians, nor even philanthropists who had the courage to shield him. It was a secret alliance, forged in whispers and loyalty, made of those who had long understood that the cost of freedom was stealth, cunning, and absolute discretion. Eleanor Whitlock remained his steadfast guide, but she was only one node in a vast web. Men and women who had lived through the brutal Reconstruction era, who had watched the promises of emancipation crumble into violence and betrayal, had come together with a single purpose: Thomas Freeman must survive. They met in the back rooms of blacksmith shops, in unlit attics above abandoned stores, in the kitchens of sympathetic households. No one trusted paper, no one left a record. All communication was through couriers who memorized messages and burned letters once delivered. It was in one of these hidden chambers that Thomas learned the full extent of their plan. Maps dotted the walls, similar to the ones Christopher Hale had shown him months ago, but now they were expanded, showing roads, safe houses, and patrol patterns across 3 states. The network's leaders spoke in hushed tones, weighing every word. Every plan assumed one thing: Thomas Freeman's life was the keystone. If he fell, the fragile hope for a new era might collapse. Thomas listened, absorbing every detail. He had become a pawn and a weapon simultaneously. His small frame allowed him to move unnoticed, but his mind had become sharper than any blade. Each member of the alliance explained his role in the coming weeks. At night, he would travel undercover, guided by couriers who would teach him the paths to safety, the hidden signals in the woods, the indistinguishable marks on fences that meant danger ahead. He was learning to vanish into the land itself. But survival was not merely about physical safety. The alliance had trained him to anticipate threats. He learned to read the subtle changes in men's faces, to detect lies hidden beneath honeyed words, to measure the tremor in a voice that promised peace while plotting murder. These lessons were not gentle, they were relentless. One mistake could unravel the entire network and place his life and the lives of dozens in immediate danger. And danger was never theoretical. Within a week of his speech, Thomas received news that a bounty had been placed on him by Southern agitators. The amount was staggering for a child's life. Men rode through the counties, searching for any sign of him, interrogating villagers, threatening families who harbored him. The network acted swiftly, shifting Thomas from one safe house to another, always a step ahead. Eleanor Whitlock and Christopher Hale coordinated the movements with precision, ensuring that no trace of the boy could be followed. Even when the night was thick with fog and the roads slick with rain, Thomas learned to blend into the landscape like a shadow, moving silently while the hunters passed within yards. But the alliance did more than protect. They armed Thomas with knowledge. Every encounter became a lesson. He observed the behavior of spies and informants. He listened to gossip twisted with malice, and he learned the code of secrecy that allowed intelligence to flow unnoticed. He carried messages sewn into the linings of his clothing, and in turn, delivered intelligence that would prevent violence, rescue families at risk, and disrupt conspiracies that sought to reignite the embers of slavery. By the end of those months, Thomas was no longer just a boy fleeing for survival. He had become the nerve center of an invisible war, the conduit through which truth traveled and deception faltered. Yet despite the constant movement, the fear, and the training, Thomas remained profoundly aware of the stakes. Every day he woke, he faced the possibility of death, not the quick, decisive kind, but the slow, deliberate kind that stalked him from every road and backwoods trail. He had watched men fall to ambushes, had seen loyal allies betrayed, and yet he continued. Survival became a discipline, a meditation, a way of existing in a world that refused to acknowledge his humanity while demanding his utmost performance. The most dangerous aspect of the alliance, Thomas realized, was not the men or the hunters, it was trust. He had to decide, sometimes in moments of split-second judgment, who he could rely upon and who might be complicit with those who wanted him silenced. One mistake could mean betrayal, and the consequences would ripple outward, destroying the careful balance the alliance had maintained for months. Every handshake, every nod, every casual conversation was loaded with potential threat, and yet, amidst the fear and constant vigilance, Thomas discovered something unexpected. Solidarity. In the eyes of those who risked their lives to protect him, he saw courage, honor, and unwavering belief in justice. The network also shaped Thomas's understanding of power. He was still a child in the eyes of the world, yet he carried the knowledge of adults who understood systems, influence, and manipulation. He observed the way newspapers could be swayed, how letters from politicians could be intercepted, how whispers could alter decisions in courtrooms. By moving through the South unseen, he became both a witness and an actor, a young mind orchestrating outcomes with intelligence far beyond his years. Months passed, and the secret alliance proved their worth. Each attempt to capture or harm Thomas failed. Each piece of intelligence he delivered thwarted plots that could have reignited civil war on a local scale. The boy who had been purchased for $5 had become untouchable, not because of physical strength, but because of the combined precision, loyalty, and courage of a network of humans committed to one purpose: protecting the idea he represented, a single child, transformed into a symbol of resistance, capable of shaping the course of history with every silent movement he made. Through it all, Thomas never forgot Eleanor Whitlock. She remained the moral center, the constant presence that reminded him why survival mattered. Christopher Hale remained the strategist, the mind that turned lessons into action. And the hidden allies, the farmers, merchants, teachers, and runaway slaves who risked everything, showed him the cost and value of trust. Together, they formed the invisible scaffolding that allowed a child to defy the odds and alter the trajectory of a nation. By the time the bounty hunters had dispersed and the immediate threats had been neutralized, Thomas understood a crucial truth. Survival alone was not enough. One had to move with purpose, influence events, and strike decisively when opportunity arose. The alliance had not only protected him, they had forged him into someone capable of wielding his intellect and courage as weapons. The child purchased for $5 was now an agent of change, walking unseen but leaving consequences in his wake. And as he stared at the maps, the safe houses, and the coded messages that had become his lifeline, Thomas Freeman realized that the secret alliance had done more than protect him. They had created the conditions for him to challenge the South, to confront injustice, and to ensure that his life and the lessons of his survival would resonate far beyond the hidden woods, courtyards, and backroads where he had first learned to disappear. Years after Thomas Freeman's life had shifted the course of history, the echoes of his actions still lingered in every corner of the South. He was no longer a child bought for $5. No longer the boy who had run through forests, delivered secret messages, and survived conspiracies. He had become a symbol of defiance, intellect, and resilience, a living proof that the human spirit could endure, and even triumph over unimaginable oppression. Yet his greatest victory was not in the battles he fought or the conspiracies he unraveled. It was the legacy he left, a foundation that would outlive him and shape generations yet unborn. Thomas understood, better than anyone, that survival alone did not create change. One could live yet remain invisible to history. He had been visible from the moment Eleanor Whitlock took him under her care, and every action since had expanded his influence, but influence carried its own burdens. Each ally who had protected him, each secret meeting, every coded message delivered through dark forests was a thread in a web that could unravel with the slightest misstep. By the time Thomas reached adulthood, he had internalized the lesson. To leave a legacy, one must act not only boldly but with foresight, shaping events so they could endure beyond immediate danger. The first element of Thomas's legacy was education. He established clandestine schools in abandoned cabins, hidden attics, and church basements. Former slaves, children, and even sympathetic poor whites came to learn under his guidance. He taught reading, arithmetic, geography, and history, but also critical thinking, strategy, and the subtle arts of observation. Thomas wanted them to know what he had learned. Knowledge was not merely power, it was protection. It could prevent injustice before it occurred. It could elevate a mind beyond the chains of circumstance. The children who sat cross-legged on dirt floors under flickering lantern light were the living continuation of his survival, and through them, his ideals would ripple into the future. Thomas also formalized the networks that had saved his life. The secret alliance that had moved him from safe house to safe house evolved into a covert system of support for activists, abolitionists, and informants. He trained trusted allies in communication codes, reconnaissance, and intelligence-gathering techniques, ensuring that messages critical to freedom and justice would reach their destinations even in the face of obstruction. These networks were delicate, invisible, and adaptable, built to survive attempts at suppression while laying the groundwork for organized resistance across multiple states. The child once hunted by bounty hunters had grown into a strategist who could orchestrate actions that reshaped power without firing a single gun. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Thomas's legacy, however, was the moral courage he exemplified. The young man who had delivered speeches that nearly ignited a civil conflict had instilled in countless followers the principle that one must act in accordance with conscience, even in the face of lethal opposition. Thomas never wavered in moments of extreme threat. He faced mobs, corrupt officials, and those who wished him dead, yet he remained unshaken. His courage became a template, a blueprint for leadership rooted not in fear but in conviction. Those who followed him learned that change required risk, vigilance, and the courage to speak truth even when the world demanded silence. Thomas also understood that history is written not only by actions but by memory. He made certain that his story, and the stories of those who had been enslaved, were documented, preserved, and shared. Diaries, coded letters, oral histories, and later published accounts captured the experiences of those whose lives had been invisible to the broader public. Through this meticulous preservation, future generations could learn not only of the horrors endured, but of the strategies, resilience, and intelligence required to overcome them. History could not erase what Thomas Freeman made impossible to forget. Over time, Thomas's influence extended beyond the South. His teachings and networks reached northern states, connecting former slaves, abolitionist groups, and sympathetic politicians in a chain of knowledge and support. His intelligence-gathering methods informed legal strategies, civil rights advocacy, and community organization. He was careful, always, never seeking fame, always working behind the scenes, because he knew the fragility of success. One public misstep could unravel decades of careful planning. Yet by staying vigilant, he ensured that his work endured beyond the immediate recognition of any era. Even in death, Thomas Freeman's legacy remained unassailable. Communities erected schools and libraries in his memory. Scholars cited his life as evidence of the transformative power of education and courage. Secret alliances that he had nurtured evolved into formal organizations fighting injustice, ensuring that the sacrifices, strategies, and knowledge he had cultivated continued to influence policy and societal attitudes for decades. The boy purchased for $5 had become a catalyst for structural change. A single life reshaping the moral and political fabric of a nation. The most remarkable aspect of this legacy, however, was its ripple effect on human belief. Those who learned his story, whether through spoken word, manuscripts, or observation, recognized the potential of the individual to disrupt systems of oppression. Thomas's life became a proof that intelligence, courage, and moral clarity could overcome wealth, violence, and entrenched societal hierarchies. In small towns and large cities, in classrooms and secret gatherings, people cited his life as a source of inspiration. They repeated the truth that even the smallest, most vulnerable individual could become an agent of profound historical change. In the final analysis, Thomas Freeman's legacy was multifaceted. It was a combination of education, networks, moral courage, historical preservation, and quiet influence. But above all, it was a testament to the human spirit. From the day he was purchased for $5, he transformed circumstances designed to erase him into opportunities for knowledge, strategy, and influence. He had become more than a survivor. He had become a symbol, a blueprint, and a foundation for generations yet unborn. And as the sun set over the plantations, the forests, and the cities he had touched, one truth remained. The boy bought for $5 had changed history forever, leaving a legacy that would endure long after the chains of his childhood had been broken. Thomas Freeman's journey is one of the most remarkable yet often overlooked stories in American history. Born into slavery and purchased for just $5, Thomas began life at the lowest possible rung of society, a child whose existence could have been forgotten and erased. Yet his life was anything but ordinary. Through intelligence, courage, and the guidance of allies like Eleanor Whitlock, Thomas transformed from a helpless child into a young strategist, activist, and symbol of resilience whose actions would ripple across generations. His story challenges the common narratives of the post-Civil War South, revealing the power of one individual to influence history and inspire change even under the harshest oppression. From his earliest days, Thomas exhibited extraordinary observation skills and a keen intellect that allowed him to navigate a world built to suppress him. He learned to read and write in secret, gaining knowledge that became his greatest weapon. Unlike others who remained confined by the cruel limitations imposed upon them, Thomas used education not merely to survive, but to prepare for a role that would shape history. Each book he read, each lesson he absorbed, and each observation of the world around him became a tool, building the foundation for the missions, alliances, and strategies that would later define his life. His education was not for personal gain alone, it was a weapon of liberation, both for himself and for those he would come to protect. Thomas Freeman's life was a testament to the courage required to act against injustice. From delivering secret messages, observing conspiracies, and surviving threats to his life, to standing in courts and speaking truth to power, Thomas demonstrated that bravery is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Every choice he made carried extraordinary risk, yet he never allowed fear to dictate his actions. Instead, he turned danger into opportunity, using each challenge to strengthen his strategies, sharpen his mind, and inspire others. His courage became a blueprint for those around him, showing that even the youngest, seemingly weakest individuals could disrupt systems of oppression with careful planning, knowledge, and determination. A significant part of Thomas's legacy lies in the alliances he built and the networks that protected him. These secret alliances were composed of men and women who risked everything to ensure his survival. They provided safe houses, guidance, intelligence, and support that allowed Thomas to carry out missions critical to the lives of others and the safety of entire communities. Through these alliances, Thomas learned the value of trust, loyalty, and collective action. He also learned that one life, when supported and guided by the courage and wisdom of others, could influence far more than a single individual acting alone. These networks became the backbone of his efforts and helped extend his influence far beyond what a single person could achieve. Thomas Freeman's impact extended far beyond immediate survival or rebellion. His speeches, intelligence work, and strategic thinking challenged societal norms and inspired movements for education, equality, and justice. He showed the South and the nation that the promise of freedom cannot be realized without courage, knowledge, and moral clarity. His life demonstrated that true leadership is rooted not in privilege, wealth, or violence, but in intellect, principle, and unwavering determination. He proved that change is possible even in societies structured to suppress dissent and limit opportunity. Ultimately, Thomas Freeman's story is a legacy that transcends his lifetime. His work in educating others, building secret networks, and standing boldly against injustice created pathways for future generations to follow. He became more than a survivor. He became a symbol, a teacher, and a strategist whose influence outlived him. Each story passed down about his courage, intelligence, and resilience has the power to inspire individuals to challenge the status quo, pursue knowledge, and act decisively in the face of injustice. Thomas Freeman's life teaches us that no circumstance, however dire, can extinguish the human spirit. From being purchased for $5 to leaving a mark on history, Thomas embodies the idea that one person's determination can alter the course of nations. His legacy is not just in the missions he completed or the speeches he delivered. It is in the inspiration he leaves for everyone willing to act with courage, intelligence, and unwavering conviction. By remembering Thomas Freeman, sharing his story, and reflecting on the lessons of his life, we honor a legacy that continues to empower, guide, and inspire generations across the world.